Hello everyone, welcome back to another Xile Rants video. We are covering the situation in Ukraine again today. It's been about 6 months since my last video on the Ukraine war, and a lot has changed since then, so I wanted to take some time and go through the new tactics, the new front lines, the new situation on the ground. I was planning on waiting until a peace deal was in the works until I made this video, but it's looking increasingly likely that's not going to happen, at least this year. We'll talk about that in a sec. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the trigger and get this video out. So first, let's go over exactly what we'll be discussing in this video. I'm going to start with a timeline of events that have happened since I made my last video back in February. Then we will talk about the peace deal and why there isn't a peace deal and what I think the peace deal should or will look like. We'll take a look at the domestic situation in each country. How is their economy doing specifically? Then we'll talk about the changes in tactics. There have been some interesting developments in the realm of tactics that are a large departure from the tactics that have been used up until now. Then we'll talk about the changes in the actual front line, and I have a new resource that can show us those changes day by day in real time, which is pretty neat, so definitely stick around for that. And then finally, we will look ahead a little bit at the future and talk about, kind of the direction I think the geopolitical situation is heading. Okay, so first let's go over what I missed. Literally like the day after I posted my first video, the now infamous meeting between Trump and Zelensky at the White House occurred. Roll the clip.
You got to be more thankful, because let me tell you, you don't have the cards. With us, you have the cards, but without us, you don't have any cards.
Yeah, you all remember that. It was a complete shit show. But the question I see everyone asking is, why did this happen? And I think that the simplest explanation is a psychological one, okay? So Trump is a classic textbook narcissist, okay? And narcissists need what's called narcissistic supply. There are two types of narcissistic supply, positive and negative. A positive narcissistic supply is like what he receives from Putin. He's able to put Putin on a pedestal, and then by associating himself with Putin, it also boosts his own ego, his own image in his mind. That's why, up until very recently, he has been such a outspoken defender or champion of Putin. The other side of that coin is the negative narcissistic supply. And that's what we saw at this meeting in the White House. When J.D. Vance said, "Have you even said thank you? Huh? Have you said thank you?" That was him prompting Trump for some negative narcissistic supply. And a negative narcissistic supply basically means you're a bully. You're just beating down on somebody who is in a less powerful position than you in order to make yourself feel bigger. Classic bully mentality. So that's what happened. But as the months wore on since that meeting, and that meeting had some real consequences that we'll talk about when we get to the frontline section. But a couple months later, Trump kind of changed his tune on Putin. He started tweeting things like, "I've always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He's gone absolutely crazy." Now, Trump never would have said something even close to this in the months before he took office, right? He was constantly defending Putin, and around that February meeting, he was calling Zelensky a dictator and all kinds of messed up stuff. So this was a pretty marked change in tone for him. It's changed so much to the point that I think literally today he tweeted something like, basically glazing Ukraine, basically saying like, Ukraine is like strong, their army is like very professional, we could like take back all of Ukraine's territory with NATO. Yeah, he's kind of done with Putin's shit, because Putin has stopped heaping praise upon Trump. He stopped Trump is no longer in the good graces of Putin because, well, there's a lot of reasons. We'll get to that when we get to the peace deal. Okay. Also, I think this occurred in May or maybe April. the U.S. and Ukraine signed a minerals deal. This deal basically said that in the Donetsk and Luhansk region, the United States government would invest in or sponsor the rare earth element and other mining industries in those regions. And I think this is actually a good deal for both Ukraine and the U.S. because, well, first of all, for Ukraine, it gives them a much needed source of revenue, a much needed source of income in the future. And it also gives the U.S. a reason to stick around, basically, right? We all know Trump is a very transactional person. And this is kind of, he now has chips on the table, right? He actually has something to lose now should Ukraine fall to Russia's invasion. So it makes our commitment to Ukraine that much stronger. And then, I think this was about a month ago, there was another meeting between Zelensky and Trump at the White House. And this time Zelensky actually wore a suit. And the overall tone of this meeting was much more constructive, much more conciliatory, and overall just much more productive, I think. So I think that the main arc that we've seen in the past 6 months is a turn from being, Putin's loyalist soldier to now kind of shifting more over to openly supporting Zelensky, which is obviously a good thing. Again, there are multiple reasons why this happened. The narcissism thing. I think another big part of it is that the main Russian agents in his administration, such as Tulsi Gabbard, have kind of fallen out of favor. And once they fall out of favor, he stops hearing Russian propaganda blasted in his ear day after day constantly. So I think that his information environment has changed, like inside the White House. And I think that is also contributing to his shift in stance. Okay, so now let's talk about the peace deal or lack thereof. First of all, we all know that there was recently a huge meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska. Trump literally rolled out the red carpet for Putin, and at the end of the day, accomplished nothing. Love to see it. Yeah, so this meeting was essentially Trump saying, pretty please, can we have a ceasefire? Can we have a ceasefire, pretty please? And Putin basically just said, niet. It was humiliating to see the U.S. Entertain a dictator such as Putin in this way. It was, again, it goes back to the narcissistic supply thing of Trump. He wants to show off to the world his great relationship with Putin as a way to boost his own ego and self-aggrandizement. But I think at the end of the day, after this meeting, Putin and Trump did that press conference where they didn't take any questions, and Trump just looked defeated. He looked like he really thought he could make some headway here, and he just didn't at all. And I think this was the moment that in his own mind, Trump decided that he was no longer going to pursue Putin like a fair maiden or something. Putin was no longer the apple of his eye, right? He was going to put the geostrategic considerations above his own psychological handicaps. Okay. Putin did actually propose a peace deal, but in exchange not for a peace deal, just for a ceasefire, Ukraine would have to give up all of the remaining areas in the Donetsk and Luhansk region that they occupy. Now, this is not a big region of territory. It's not that big in terms of land area, but it is the most strategically located and the most heavily fortified section of Ukrainian territory still occupied by Ukraine. Okay? So losing this area would be the equivalent of France like losing the Maginot Line in the lead up to World War II or something. It would be very, very bad for any future conflicts between the two sides. And that's Putin's goal, right? He wants to knock out this large area of territory, allow Russians to penetrate further into Ukraine, and then in 3 months when he's done reorganizing his army, he can claim that Ukrainian drones violated Russian airspace and just restart the whole invasion. Okay, so luckily Trump or Trump's team didn't bite on that front. Another funny development that's been having is everyone's done with Steve Witkoff. Okay, so Steve Witkoff was the special envoy appointed to negotiate with Putin. He's been to Moscow many, many times over the past couple months, and everyone's just kind of tired of his shit. I've seen multiple articles where people on the American side are fed up with him because he's not communicating what Putin wants to them very effectively, and people on the Russian side are done with him because he's taking, his orders from the White House, his orders from Trump, and is either ignoring them or completely misconstruing them. Steve Witkoff is not a diplomat. He is one of Trump's real estate buddies, and so he views this entire process, this entire negotiation, as a real estate deal. You get land in exchange for X. That's the way he views it. He does not understand geopolitics. He does not understand, matters of military. He's just a real estate dude, and that's the only lens he can view the world through. So that's why he's so ineffective, is because he's incapable of understanding the real problems, the real conflict that is at the heart of this war. He just views it as a dispute over land, which it is not. Okay. Yeah, so hopefully Steve Witkoff gets fired or gets shut out soon, because he's basically useless. All right, and then lastly, I will talk about my own fairy tale peace deal. I mentioned this in my last video, but things have changed a little bit since then. So first of all, I still like the idea of some sort of alliance in the post-war world, not necessarily with NATO, but with the Baltic countries, Finland, Poland, and then either Germany or France. I think that is a path to lasting peace, and I also think it is not going to invite Russian aggression in the same way that Ukraine joining NATO might. Okay, so that's the hope, is kind of balancing the security of Ukraine versus the potential of Russia feeling threatened. And then in terms of land, well, in the past, Ukraine had the Kursk invasion to kind of barter for some sort of land swap. I think now the best bet is just a frontline freeze, right? Kind of like the situation in Cyprus, where they just freeze the front line, and those are the borders now, even though they're very, very wonky and don't make a lot of sense. I think that's kind of the best that we can hope for. And then, I would want, or I would hope that there'd be some sort of international coalition of troops that would be peacekeepers. Not the UN. The UN can fuck off. Everyone hates the UN. They're useless. But Belgium or Sweden or India, if they want to, why not? Yeah, some sort of neutral third party would be ideal. Okay, so now let's discuss the situation inside both countries, and we will start with Ukraine. So, back in July, Ukraine passed a very important milestone. 50% of all weapons used by Ukraine are now produced in Ukraine. This is a big deal because for the past couple years, Ukraine has been very heavily reliant on the weapons from America and on weapons from the EU. But every day that passes, they are becoming less and less reliant. They are ramping up production of weapons themselves, namely drones. The Ukrainian drone industry has absolutely exploded. They are producing thousands upon thousands of drones a month. Yeah, it's really incredible to see their production capabilities ramp up so heavily in that area. They've also made technological developments. They've been developing their own drone platforms and their own missile platforms. Yeah, so it's pretty significant change in terms of Ukrainian weapon procurement. The other big thing that's started to happen is that Russia has increasingly been going after civilian targets in Ukraine. I likened it to the Blitz, but instead of using airplanes, Russia is using drones, or more commonly glide bombs. The advantage of a glide bomb is that it is unaffected by a jammer, because basically you launch a glide bomb and you set it on a certain trajectory, and then it will just follow that trajectory. There's no, you don't control it. Once after it's launched, you don't control it at all. It just kind of glides gently down into your target before exploding and slamming into it. But explicitly going after civilian targets, of course, has its consequences. It's one of the things that Trump cited in that tweet I showed earlier as to why Putin is going crazy. And it's just not effective. I mean, you're just going to piss off the population even more, and you aren't doing enough economic damage to really justify the morale cost, in my opinion. The one exception to that is they have gone after Ukrainian power plants, energy infrastructure a number of times, and those strikes, obviously do real damage. But just hitting random, apartment buildings and hospitals and stuff, it's really useless and pointless. And half the time, it's not even on purpose. They're aiming for some sort of actual military target. And again, because they can't control the glide bombs, they just end up slamming into civilian infrastructure, and nobody really cares on the Russian side because, oh well. In order to bypass Ukrainian air defenses, there's a sneaky little tactic that Russia has been deploying recently, where the first couple waves of glide bombs or drones they send are dummies. They have no explosives attached to them, and thus they're much cheaper and much less costly to lose. So then Ukraine, wastes all their drone technology, all their limited missile batteries on shooting down these dummy drones. And then by the fifth wave, the real drones are coming, the real glide bombs are coming, and because Ukraine has exhausted all of its air defenses already, they're able to actually hit their targets. This is a tactic that they've used numerous times now to penetrate Ukrainian air defenses. Okay, now let's shift focus to the Russian side. So you might be thinking that, the Russian economy is not doing well, and there is a lot of truth to that, but there is an important caveat. So basically, if the war were to end tomorrow, the Russian economy would fold in on itself. Okay? And there's a couple reasons for this. The first is that, as counterintuitive as it may seem, the Russian economy has become addicted to this war, addicted to death. Okay. So, if you're an average Russian, middle-class mom, your life is not good. Unless you live in St. Petersburg or Moscow, your standard of living is shit compared to any Western country. Okay, it's awful. All these, medium-sized cities like Kazan or Tver or Novgorod, they're not doing so hot, and they haven't been doing so hot for like 30 years. So basically all economic opportunity in all of these moderately sized, think like you could compare them to like Cleveland, Ohio. All the Cleveland, Ohios of Russia are not doing well, okay? But, let's say you're this hypothetical Russian mother living in one of these crummy mid-sized cities, and your child dies, right? Your son dies in the war. You now receive a massive payout. I mean, you receive like 20 or 30 years worth of income, okay? The income that you receive from the death of your child is worth 20 or 30 years of your wages that you'd be able to earn in this city. But now you have all this money, where do you spend it? Well, because all of these people are getting all of this money, it is essentially fueling a boom in the Russian middle class, as crazy as it sounds. So now there are all these boutique, restaurants and bakeries and stores popping up in these medium-sized cities that are fueled entirely on the disposable income that these Russian citizens now have from the death of their children, or from their children serving in the Russian army, which sounds crazy, but that's the way it is. So if the war were to end, that stream of money gets cut off, and so the Russian middle class, which was experiencing a period of brief resurgence, kind of slinks back down. Okay. Another important economic development is Ukraine has been going after Russian fuel refineries. Okay. They have successfully decreased the refining capability of Russia by about 17 or 18% just in the last 6 months. Okay. That doesn't sound like a lot, but that is a huge, huge, huge number, especially for Russia, because Russia finances its war, funds its war, primarily through the sale of oil and petroleum products and fuel. So the less fuel they're able to refine, the less value added they are on the economic chain, the less money that they make. And this is even causing fuel shortages within Russia. There's been about a 30% price increase in the price of gasoline just in the past 2 months, which is insane. So yeah, Russia, the petrostate, is now running out of petrol, which is crazy. Yeah, this is obviously a good and worthwhile strategy. I think the Ukrainian drone strikes and missile strikes are doing real damage to the Russian economy and the Russian war effort. Russia is also experiencing not hyperinflation, but pretty bad inflation. They're at about 10% month over month, year over year right now, which is not great. I mean, even at the peak of COVID, the highest the U.S. hit was 8%. And really, for most of that period, we were hovering at about 5.56%. So 10% inflation is really bad, although the Russian chair of the equivalent of the Federal Reserve has been doing a pretty good job of trying to balance the inflation versus the overall economy. Okay, I mean, her job's impossible, but she's been doing as well of a job as you realistically can. Another issue with just wrapping up the war and demobilizing all these soldiers is that a lot of these soldiers are criminals. Okay, so almost the incarcerated population of Russia has dropped by 3/4 since this war started, because all of the criminals that were held in all of these jails have essentially been conscripted into the army. And the deal is, they serve for a year or whatever, and then they get to be free. And this means that if the war were ever to end, there would be hundreds of thousands of sometimes very dangerous, very violent criminals now suddenly loose on the streets of Russia. And that would just be an absolute disaster in terms of, domestic peace, domestic security. It would be a catastrophe. So that's another reason why Russia can't afford to just pack it up and call it a day, because if they did that, then all of these very violent criminals who also, have been traumatized by an entire year or 2 or 3 of constant warfare would just have free range inside their country. Yeah, nobody wants that. Another milestone that occurred is that Russia has officially passed 1 million casualties. Okay, this is a huge number. That doesn't mean 1 million people have died, but that includes dead, wounded, and captured. Okay, 1 million people. Think about that. That is more casualties than the U.S. took in World War I and World War II combined. Okay, it is a astronomical number. The Afghanistan invasion in the 80s. The Soviet Union only had 80,000 casualties, and that was enough to completely collapse the Soviet Union. Now we're at 1 million, right? We're at 10 times that number. The Ukrainian casualties are about a third. They're at about 300,000, which is not great because their population is much smaller. But yeah, in terms of manpower, Ukraine is still holding off on conscripting its 18 to 24-year-olds. And instead is focusing on people 40 to 50 right now, whereas Russia is basically scraping the bottom of the barrel of their, remote regions, you could say, because Putin really, at all costs, does not want to order another mass mobilization, because he knows if he does that, then there's a very real possibility of the people of St. Petersburg and Moscow, who up until this point have been sitting pretty because it's not their sons or daughters going to die on the front lines, but there's a very real chance that they could turn against Putin, and yeah, he could be ousted. So he fears the domestic uprising potential of ordering another mass mobilization, which is why he's promising ludicrous amounts of money for death and for even just signing up for the army in the first place. and is, conscripting criminals and doing all these other things. Oh, and taking foreign volunteers from like North Korea and stuff. All right, now let's discuss some of the tactical changes that have occurred on the ground. So at the end of my last video, I talked about how the tactics of the Russian army had transitioned from armored assaults with, tanks and armored personnel carriers and stuff, trying to blitz past Ukrainian lines and surround them and things like that, to human waves, because the Russia was running out of armored vehicles, so they were sending in human waves trying to overwhelm Ukrainian defenders, but it was not going very well. Okay, tactics have changed once again, and Russia's new tactics are, in my opinion, much more effective. Small infiltration groups are now the new meta. So, okay, imagine outside of the major urban areas, right? Imagine the entire front line as a tapestry of positions. These positions could be a ruined building, or a farmhouse, or a trench, or a small forest, anything that gives you cover from artillery and drones, okay? And the entire front line now has essentially devolved into small infiltration groups of 1 to 4 soldiers trying to take these positions from each other. Okay, so a small assault group will set out in the middle of the night, maybe crawl their way slowly, inching their way forward to the next position held by Ukraine, and then at the brink of dawn they will execute an ambush and try and wipe out the defenders and try and take that position for themselves. So that is the direction that we are seeing this war shift in. The massive casualties Russia was sustaining from their human wave tactics, I think they realized were not sustainable and were not particularly effective. So yeah, they've switched things up. Drones are still the main fear in terms of your average infantry soldier. Like, seeing a drone above you is basically a death sentence unless you have cover in one of these positions. Forests are very, very important for that reason. If you look at when we look at the frontline map later, a lot of the Russian advances have been through forests, through tree lines or along tree lines, specifically because it gives them cover from drones. Now, there has been a change slightly in drone warfare as well. So I talked about last video how jammers were becoming very common in order to disrupt Ukrainian drones or disrupt Russian drones and prevent them from hitting their targets. But the Ukraine army has adapted, and now instead of flying a kamikaze drone directly into a position or directly into a concentration of troops, the Ukrainian army has begun using these bigger drone platforms, such as this Vampire drone right here. And what these drones do is they hover above the range of these jammers, so they can't be jammed, and then instead of slamming into their target, they actually drop grenades or mortar rounds down onto their targets. And this is much more effective because, first of all, it's more cost effective, assuming these drones don't get shot down, because you can reuse these Vampire drones over and over and over again. And also, in a lot of cases, especially if the position you're trying to hit is down in a valley, you can usually hover outside of the range of jammers and be totally safe from the main way that you can counter drone warfare. Ukraine has also been targeting Russian logistics very heavily. So outside of that position maneuvering warfare I mentioned earlier, the main other type of warfare that we're seeing is drone and missile attacks on Russian positions well behind the front lines, at ammo depots, at command centers. Last week there was a huge strike on a major railway. Anything to delay or disrupt troops from actually reaching these frontline positions, right? Yeah. The goal is to attrition any reinforcements, any units coming to patch up holes or reinforce the front line as long as possible so that the Ukrainian positions can hold out as long as possible. Okay, so we are going to use this tool here. This is called a deep state, very helpful, to kind of show the progression of the front lines. There's 3 theaters we're going to focus on. The first is this Kursk/Sumy theater. The second is the Pokrovsk theater, which is still relevant and still very important. Probably could be considered the main theater of this war. And the last one we'll take a look at is Kupiansk, which is I did not cover in my last video. Okay, we'll start here in February 2025 with Kursk. So as you can see, this Kursk incursion used to be much bigger. It used to cover this whole area here, but slowly over the course of the late months of 2024, it was being worn down bit by bit by bit. The Russian army was chipping away. But that's okay. The goal here was never really to actually invade Russia, to occupy Russian territory. It was just to buy time and distract from the other more important fronts. But right here, soon you will see a complete withdrawal, which will happen right about here. Okay. So hold up, let me pause it right here for a second. So we're in March now. What actually happened here was that because of that meeting between Trump and Zelensky in the White House, the White House briefly cut off Ukraine from intelligence sharing. Okay, so they no longer had access to like satellite images that showed the positions of the Russian army. Because of that, the Ukrainian command was unable to predict the vectors or the directions that the next Russian army assault would come from. And that is very dangerous. That is very bad. Especially in a position like this where they were surrounded from 3 sides with only one method of retreat. So the decision was made to effectively pull out of Kursk. They did not lose, I think, hardly any troops during this, although they lost some equipment. But overall, the retreat was very well organized. It was not a chaotic or hasty retreat, as you can see. So then the Russian army kept advancing, kept chipping away at the little bit of territory that remained. Oh, I should explain the colors here. Okay. Green is territory that was occupied by Russia, but has since been taken back by Ukraine over, I think, a week ago. So all of this was taken by Russia in the very early stages of the war, and obviously is back in Ukraine's hands. Blue is territory recently captured by Ukraine. Red is territory taken by Russia, and then the gray stuff is kind of the no man's land, the territory where the positions that I talked about earlier still overlap. There may be Ukrainian-held positions on top of Russian-held positions, and neither side has a full dominance of the area. Okay, let's continue. I'm on 5 times speed, by the way. So we're in April now, and you'll see, yeah, here we go. You'll see that as the Ukrainian army gets pushed out of Kursk, first of all, they do some limited counterattacks over on this side. But the Russian army will actually start properly invading the Sumy region of Ukraine. And as you can see, it's already happening. Their main goal here is the city of Sumy itself, which if they can take will greatly expose this entire northern stretch of Ukraine here. Here we go. Here's the main invasion. It will greatly expose this entire northern region of Ukraine to potential Russian invasion and Russian occupation. Okay, so here's the main Russian push, and they're pushing along this main road here. But eventually, it just kind of stalls. Okay, so let's see, we're in about June right now. By the end of June, the Russian offensive completely stalls, and Ukraine actually starts making counterattacks. So you'll see over the next couple months that there will be a counterattack in this vector, in this direction, whose goal is to sort of go around and flank this Russian offensive from behind. And let's see, we are now in August, so we're almost caught up to present day. Yeah, effectively, the main point here is that while Ukraine did lose Kursk, the Sumy invasion has been completely halted, and we're actually seeing some reversals. There's a big one. That was a huge counterattack right there. We're actually seeing some reversals in terms of gaining territory back on this front. Okay, so that's the Kursk front. This is the situation as of yesterday. All right, let's look at the Pokrovsk front, because this is the most important front here. February 1st. Okay, wow. Yeah. So this is the direction that Russia has by far gained the most ground. The goal of this entire offensive, right, is to capture this city of Pokrovsk. And of course, it still has yet to happen. Let's watch. So the main direction that Russia has really advanced in is this one right here. But this, yeah, here we go. You can see this rapid advance that took place over the course of late February. The problem here is that this land is useless. There's not any really major settlements along here. Most of these are small villages, and there's nothing strategically important in this direction that Russia can use, which is why they've gained so much ground, because it has been not so heavily defended. Whereas Pokrovsk, this area here, is very, very hotly defended. You can see in the blue and the green splotches here, these are all Ukrainian counterattacks that successfully took some sort of territory back. Okay, hold up. Let me pause here. So, let's see. We are in, May. So this was where things really started to take a turn. Russia was able to advance between the cities of Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk and cut the supply line between the two, which is a big deal. Of course, both cities can still be supplied from other directions, but this was a major, major development. Let's continue. You'll see that this is the direction now that Russia seems to be focusing most of its efforts, right? And the goal is to kind of wrap around in this direction and flank Pokrovsk from the north. All right, so they've kind of given up on this southern vector because it was too heavily defended. They changed directions to go up north, and with this sweeping attack over here to the left. And soon you will see a major Russian breakthrough. There it is. Okay, so let's see where we are. Now we're in August. Okay, so this was a major Russian actual breakthrough. This is an actual breakthrough, which is very rare in this war. There have been very few actual breakthroughs, but as you can see, over the course of just 2 days, the Russian army managed to penetrate Ukrainian lines and advance very, very far. Now, when this happened, me and a lot of other people were understandably freaking out because this offensive actually penetrated so far that it actually captured some of the positions in the second line of Ukrainian defenses. The second line meaning, like, after Pokrovsk falls, they're the positions that the army will fall back to. And that's really bad because if they can hold those positions, they can effectively penetrate Ukrainians' second defensive line. And then if Pokrovsk falls, they've already have that done. And yeah, the whole Ukrainian war effort in this region would crumble. But luckily, that's not what happened. Let's keep watching. Boom. Okay. So that happened really fast. Let's slow that down. So in just a single day, Ukraine shuttled in advanced units. So I think people from the Azov Brigade and some other very, very advanced elite fighting units, and they managed to completely cut this Russian offensive to shreds. So they actually achieved here an encirclement. And encirclements are like the holy grail in warfare, right? If you achieve an encirclement, essentially the troops that are left in this pocket are done for. They're sitting ducks. Their only options are to wait for rescue, to try and break out, which is unlikely, or to just surrender. Now, these troops can actually still be supplied through drones, which is one difference in sort of the modern nature of warfare in this conflict. But, as we will see, these pockets of troops here have been slowly being ground down, and there have been numerous surrenders happening. So right there, one of the pockets was liquidated. There have been some more limited Ukrainian counterattacks along here. And it's also worth pointing out that the actual territory Russia controls is very narrow, especially right here, and especially on this river crossing here. So what Ukraine is actually doing is that they're leaving these pockets of troops alive, allowing them to be resupplied by drones, and then ambushing and attacking the units that try and cross this river or that try and make it through this narrow stretch of land here to try and reinforce these positions deeper into the front line. So they've effectively turned this Russian breakthrough into a death trap, because in order to hold these positions, Russia has to reinforce them, but the path they have to take to reinforce them is extremely precarious, extremely narrow, especially trying to cross this river right here. And as you can see, Ukraine is trying to pressure this particular part of the front line from both sides, and maybe a month from now they'll actually achieve an encirclement, and this entire section of the front line will collapse and fall back into Ukraine's hands. Notice also that they haven't even reached Pokrovsk. This is like a gray zone. There was like a infiltration mission conducted here, but I think it's already been beaten back. So the entire goal of this Russian summer offensive was to take the city, and they did not take the city. They effectively failed in their main goal that they had for this year, and because they didn't take it during the summer offensive, it's unlikely that they will be able to take it before the year is up. Maybe once the ground freezes in winter, they'll have another opportunity, but for at least until, say, December, it's very unlikely that this city will fall. And this is kind of the pivotal battle, right? Because if this city falls, it means that Ukraine will have to retreat back to their secondary defensive positions, which are like somewhere over here, I think. And that will concede a large amount of territory to Russia, which is exactly what they want. And then that will give Russia an advantage in any future peace negotiations. But if Ukraine can hold this city, it will be a massive thorn in the Russian side, especially in the event of a frontline freeze. This is like a needle right in their back that Ukraine could easily use to not only defend but to penetrate Russian lines. This area, like I said earlier, if we jump back to February, has seen the most dramatic gains in terms of territory. But again, first of all, it's not that much. We're talking, the scale here is not that large. We're talking, what is this? This is like 50 kilometers, not that much. And that was over the course of 6 months. And like I said, this territory is very strategically unimportant. Oh, and they also, of course, have not even reached Konstantinivka at all. Okay, last front line. Let's go rewind the clock back to February. And here we have Kupiansk. Okay, so this is another of the theaters that has seen the most fierce fighting within the last 6 months. Let's get the timer in gear. The goal here is to capture the city of Kupiansk, because if they can do that, they can sever both of these logistical highways here, and that will basically cement their control over this, not only this entire region, but they could even potentially link up these two conflict theaters here. And they actually tried to do that. They actually invaded a little bit here. We'll see that in a second. But as you can see, the Russians make pretty steady progress. They sever this supply line here, and they successfully overrun this road network. But they are constantly suffering Ukrainian counterattacks. Nevertheless, though, their progress is relatively slow but relatively steady. We're now in June. And then towards the end of June, beginning of July, things really started to escalate, where we saw we saw very rapid Russian maneuvers, Russian advances, and here's that invasion I was talking about earlier, where they're trying to link these two conflict zones. And they actually crossed this road network, and they're trying to flank Kupiansk from the westward direction, but they suffered a pretty brutal counterattack here, which kind of put that whole flanking maneuver on hold. And I think that happened. There it is. There's that big counterattack that kind of thwarted this direction, although they are advancing on Kupiansk, and they've actually entered the city. And so now there is fierce urban warfare, urban fighting within the city itself of the Russian army trying to take control of it. But again, it has not fallen yet. It is still, the important crossroads is still in Ukrainians' hands. And yeah. So, let me zoom out real quick and do one final comparison. Here's the war back in February. And here's the war today. When you look at it on the scale of all of Ukraine, the difference in territory really isn't that much. All right, let's wrap things up. So, the future right now is very chaotic, very uncertain. It was my hope that with Trump coming into office, with giving America a fresh face, a fresh administration, that the sort of diplomatic stalemate that was occurring under the Biden administration in regards to both Ukraine and Russia and Israel and Palestine would be resolved, and it would start the process of peace. That has not happened at all. Both of these wars are still raging on, and they are just as violent and deadly as they have ever been. So, that is very bad, because it means that as global tensions continue to rise, the risk of these two conflicts spilling over into a third world war when China invades Taiwan is becoming much more likely. So because of that, I don't think we're going to even see a peace deal brought up for the rest of this year. Maybe at the end of the summer offensive next year, so the same time next year, when the frontline situation has changed and Ukraine has either repelled Russia's invasion of Pokrovsk or Pokrovsk has fallen, we'll see a reevaluation or reexamination of a peace deal. A big worrying thing that has happened recently is India is now building a closer relationship to China. So there was that famous picture of Putin, Modi, and Xi all in a room together, all walking together. And there was also a report that India and China are going to negotiate their border disputes in Aksai Chin in Kashmir in the Himalayas. This is a huge problem for the United States, because basically if in the coming conflict it was assumed that India would be a strong American ally because they were opposed to China. But if India joins China's side or even just stays neutral, this means that China does not have to worry about protecting its rear, guarding its back flank, and can devote all of its focus, all of its effort into invading Taiwan and or crushing South Korea. So this is a huge problem, and it's really Trump's fault. I mean, it's almost singularly Trump's fault. Trump has done a number of things to alienate India. He claimed credit for the peace deal between Pakistan and India, even though both Pakistan and India came out and said that he had nothing to do with it. Then he slapped a 50% tariff on India just for buying Russian oil, and I talked about in my last economics video why that was not a good idea. And then when Trump tried to call Modi to set up some sort of channel for negotiation, Modi wouldn't even take the call. Trump called 4 times. Modi ignored them because he didn't want whatever he said in that call to be misconstrued and fabricated by Trump again in the same way it was during the Pakistan-India peace negotiation. So Modi's basically done with Trump, and nobody trusts him. Nobody trusts Trump because he'll just take whatever you say or do and twist your words in such a way that makes himself look like the big strong man, even if it's not true. Yeah. So this has been, in my opinion, Trump's biggest diplomatic and geopolitical failure. And it's only been 6 months. Or it's been like, what? 8 months, 9 months. Great. Wonderful. Okay. The other big thing that's been happening recently is that Russia has made a couple incursions into NATO airspace. First, it was drones over Poland, and then recently there was a plane that flew over Estonia, I believe. These are not serious provocations, okay? Putin is not an idiot. He does not seriously believe that Russia strong can 1v1 all of NATO. No, he doesn't actually think that. Really what he's doing here is a couple things. First of all, he's probing for weakness. He's trying to figure out, in the event of a possible Russian invasion, which country, which place is the slowest to react and therefore would be the easiest to penetrate. He's also trying to get a retaliation, a response from these NATO countries, have them shoot down a Ukrainian plane, or sorry, a Russian plane, have them kill a Russian soldier, which will then be used as justification for a war. But because Russia can claim that it's an offensive war, theoretically, or it's an offensive war on part of the NATO country, theoretically Article 5 wouldn't pertain. That's the theory anyway. The exact details of how that would all pan out is highly dependent upon the individual situation, the situation on the ground, but that is Putin's idea. Okay. It wouldn't surprise me if these incursions, these probing attacks continue, but again, I don't think they represent a serious threat to the security of any NATO country. So the overall picture of these last 6 months has been America becoming increasingly isolated. The video I made about the Ukraine war last time was before all the tariffs came into effect or were even really spelled out. And now that the tariffs are here, everybody hates us. I mean, they're all of our allies, Canada, Mexico, are turning on us. The EU is becoming increasingly skeptical. Australia is trying to distance themselves from us. Japan and Korea are considering entering economic negotiations with China and cutting the US out of the picture. It's just a across-the-board retreat in terms of our diplomatic and geopolitical position, right? Our hegemonic status is in very real danger of being threatened. And I don't see this trend reversing. I think as time goes on, Trump is only going to get more and more belligerent, and everyone in the world is going to get more and more done with his shit, and is going to do everything in their power to cut America out of negotiations or economic deals whenever possible. Yeah, not great. Okay, thanks for watching. I hope that was informative. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I will catch y'all on the flip side.